Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to play and confidently neutralize the London system while maintaining possibilities to still play for a win. What I'm going to suggest is what in my view is objectively the best way to play against the London, and that is the Leningrad variation of the Dutch defense. So before we get into the concrete lines, I'm going to recommend perhaps we should define in what way exactly do we hope to achieve an opening advantage in general. We often hear that with objectively correct play, chess is always a draw. So in that case, if we use the engine to decide what is objectively best, and the engine constantly gives us an equal evaluation in the multiple possible lines, how are we to claim an advantage and play for a win in that case? The answer to that is that from the several options presented to us by the computer, we select the ones most easy to play for us and most difficult for our opponent from a purely human perspective, and we keep presenting them with this choice as often as possible. The natural outcome of this is that sooner or later, despite the position being objectively equal according to the computer, our opponent is more likely and will make a mistake. So after d4, f5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, d6, we are going to look at three options here, knight f3, knight c3, and c3. Any of the bishop moves are likely to transpose to what we're going to see in the game, so we're not going to look at them separately. And as we know, we can expect a knight move here because, as we know, knights have to be developed before bishops, so it makes more sense to start with this move order. So first we're going to look at knight c3. And in that case, we play e6, knight f3, knight c6, d5, e takes, knight takes h6, h4, bishop e6, bishop c4, bishop takes, knight takes, queen d5, queen d7. And after queen d7, we are going to look at two of white's moves, which are castles long or knight to d4, and we're going to look at knight d4 because that's a computer recommended move, and we can expect someone that wants to be prepared as white to know the opening 12 moves deep. So we're going to start with castles long, which actually gives us the bigger winning chances from a practical perspective. After queen f7, the position is completely equal, and if white takes here, we are likely to transpose the position that we're going to see shortly. So after h5, we have bishop e7, king b1, queen d5, rook takes, rook f8, knight d4, knight takes, rook takes, king d7, c4, king e6, rook hd1, a6, rook d5, rook fd8, b3, bishop f6, rook to d2, rook a to b8. What's the idea behind rook to b8? And that is that if we start pushing the pawns, what we have on the other side is white's king. So we can hope to create some meaningful tension here, which will give us some sort of an advantage. The position is completely equal from the computer's point of view, but we are going to create some practical chances here. So after king c2, there comes a very critical moment in the game, in the sense that we are forcing white to make a mistake here, and that is that capturing on b5 is not the best move, and it is understandable why white would want to make this move. It's because they have a queenside pawn majority, which they may be thinking that if they push on, they will somehow create a passed pawn. Well, that is not the case, and in fact the best move for white here is c5, in which case black can also create winning chances while the game objectively remains equal. But we are going to analyze c takes b, and after a takes b, let's say white wants to push the pawn this way, then that is an obvious mistake, because after the capture we have rook b2, king d1, rook from d to b8, let's say white captures, we capture, And now this pawn is very weak, while at the same time we have our own passed pawn which can easily promote. So obviously a4 is not a good idea in this case, and let's say white decides to make a waiting move first, like king to b1, then we activate the rook with rook to b6. White makes another waiting move, letting us reveal our hand first, in which case we just go to a8, and if white makes the careless yet not obviously wrong rook to d3, we just go to a6, and if they think they can come back to d2 and defend the a2 square, that is not the case because we have bishop to c3, and all of a sudden white does not have a good move. And if they go to d1, we just capture on a2. If they move anywhere along this rank, we just capture the other rook. So all of a sudden white has a losing position. So this is how you can create winning chances in this line. And for example, if black plays the move c5, we go to c8, then f3, bishop e7, c takes, king d1, rook c5. And now there's another mistake that white can make here. They can, for whatever reason, decide to capture this rook, in which case we are going to have a rolling queenside pawn majority. So this is the idea, and essentially when you see that you cannot create a winning chance, even though there is an opportunity to do so, you can simply bail out with equality. Let's say white keeps playing the best moves. You don't have to push for creating the advantage. But as soon as you see that things become volatile or too risky for you, you can simply bail out with equality. So for example, after rook c5, white does not take, fe4, rook dc8, king e2, rook d5, rook d5, rook c2, rook d2, rook c5, and here we have equality. Now if we look at the other line where white plays knight to d4, here we can also create winning chances by playing in a certain way. We capture the knight, queen takes, queen f7, queen a4. We play c6, long castles, d5, queen b3, a5, a3, b5, h5, b4, a4, bishop e7, rook h3, aiming for the g3 square, and then attacking the g7 square. Short castles, we're not afraid of this because we can always go to h7, queen d3, bishop f6, king b1, queen e6, rook g3, king h7, rook g6, and now black tries to exchange queens here, which makes perfect sense because white's pieces are not as well coordinated as black's pieces. White's rooks are not connected, and black's pawn storm looks slightly more menacing than white's. Also, black's bishop has some targets on the dark square diagonal, while the white's dark square bishop not so much. So the queen exchange makes perfect sense here. Bishop d6, trying to improve the bishop. Queen takes. Now let's say that white wants to avoid the queen exchange. There aren't many good squares where the queen can go to. They all look kind of passive. So for example, let's say he decides to go to b3. That is immediately a blunder because the h5 pawn falls without white having any compensation for it. Let's say instead of queen b3, he wants to go with something like queen e2. That is also not ideal because in that way he can just take the bishop. If the bishop goes to something like h2, now white is completely uncoordinated here, and after f4 he is simply winning because these pawns are marching, white's rook is cut off, the bishop is cut off, so this is simply a horrible position for white. So therefore white has to exchange. And after the rook takes, bishop f4, rook e7, rook a7, king c1, rook d7, rook e6, c3. Now this looks like a weakening move, but white needs to do something. Let's say he wants to wait. In that case, we're slowly going to improve our pieces and make the pawn storm even more threatening. So b3, it just doesn't look good from a practical point of view, because if white manages to defend this pawn, he just pushes the other on the c file, and white's king is going to get opened up sooner or later. So white decides to open the game on his own terms with c3, takes, and now obviously black cannot take because the rook is hanging. So after c5, we can already stop here, claiming that black has the better practical chances due to the multiple targets in white's position and better coordination. So that's that as far as the knight to d4 after knight to c3 variation is concerned. Now we are going to look at the other option for white here, which is c3. And in that case, we play g6, knight f3, knight c6, knight bd2, bishop g7, bishop c4, e6, castles. And e6 is a standard move in the Leningrad, because that is just simply a very good way to limit the influence of this bishop. Even though this looks like a weakness, the pawn can be defended in multiple ways, so this is a perfectly sound move. So after b4, h6, b5, knight a5, bishop d3, g5, bishop g3, b6, h3, bishop to b7, knight b3, knight takes, a takes, knight e4, queen c2, h5, knight d2, trying to exchange. We exchange, and we have a very strong bishop on this diagonal. And after h4, we have some very good practical chances. And what the normal plan for black here is not to necessarily rush with pushing the pawns, but playing king to h8 and then playing rook g2 and rook f8, and that makes the pawn storm even more viable. So this is a standard winning plan for black in this position, and that is something that you might be willing to try if you play for a win in this position. You can of course push g4 right away, but it might also be worth waiting for white to panic in this position, which is quite natural, and make a mistake first. That is what the winning plan looks like after c3. And now we're going to look at the main line here. After knight f3, we go with g6, bishop c4, e6, knight c3, bishop g7, h3, a6, a3, castles, g4, b5, bishop a2. I mean, obviously white will want to keep the bishop on this diagonal, whether the pawn on e6 is defended or not, because that he can claim is a long-term weakness, which really isn't the case, because after we go to h8, there's nothing to worry about. Even after knight g5, we just go queen to e8, g takes, e takes, h4, knight h5, and after knight h5, we're going to witness the true power of the Dutch defense, and in this case, the Leningrad Dutch, because in a lot of 1d4 mainline openings, like the Queen's Indian defense, the Queen's Gambit declined, or the Slav defense, and so on, white can get away with so many things. And that is really not the case in the Dutch defense, where one slip ends the game on the spot. For example, if we play a random move here, we can just capture the bishop because the king is pinned. A lot of other moves are also losing on the spot. For example, like queen to e2. After queen to e2, we just take on d4, because if white captures, the bishop is hanging, and we end up being up a clear pawn with a winning position. So after castles, funny enough, there is also a forced win for black, which goes like this: h6, knight h3, knight d7, bishop d5, rook b8, bishop f3, knight df6, king g2, queen f7, knight e2, rook e8, rook c1, king h7, rook g1, knight g4, knight g3. And now knight takes, and here white needs to be extremely careful. I mean, he's worse anyway, but for example, bishop takes, then we have rook takes, and now white cannot take with the pawn because of the fork. If he then takes on g4 with the bishop after rook e3, we just have rook takes, f g4, knight f4, g5, knight d3, bishop takes, and now the diagonals are extremely weak against the white's king side. So after rook f1, queen d5, this is leading to a forced checkmate. So this is no good, and after knight g3, white needs to take with the king. After which we have bishop f6, queen d3, king g7, bishop c6, rook f8, f3. We can sacrifice this knight because after f takes g, we have bishop h4, king g2, f takes, king h2, g5, bishop g3, bishop takes g3, king g3, d5, and if the bishop takes, we have queen d6, and we have two pieces attacked at the same time. If, let's say, white wants to run with the knight, then we have queen d6 again, recovering the piece, being two pawns up with a completely crushing position. So castles is also not a good option there, which leaves the only good option for white after knight h5 being queen to f3. After queen f3, we can continue to play for a win. After knight c6, knight e2, bishop b7, castles, b4. We can play h6 with some complications, but it's best not to weaken the king side yet. We have a risk-free game on the queen side, so we should start with that. Bishop d5, b takes a, rook b8, knight g3. Obviously we have to take f g3, h5, consolidating the king side, and now it is very difficult for white to break our pawn complex on the light squares. So after knight e6, knight e5, we have this very interesting move, knight e5, enabling white to make a mistake again, because after d takes e5, we have queen e6, a queen sacrifice, with the idea that bishop takes, we have bishop f3. So this is completely losing for white because we just win the exchange after this move. So essentially after knight e5, white has to capture with the bishop, after which we take with the d pawn, and then knight g7, king g7, bishop b7, e4, cutting off the queen, queen f1, rook b7, queen a6, queen b8. The computer evaluation in this position is 0.00. However, if I ask you the question, who would you rather be, black or white, there is only one answer, and that is black. And that is for the reason that black can attack multiple targets in white's position, and that is the pawn on a3. He can harass white's queen, he can attack the pawn on c2. At the same time, white has no way of getting through to black's king, and therefore this position is much better for black in pure practical terms. And that is exactly what we mentioned in the introduction, that despite the computer evaluation, you should aim for positions and lines that pose most practical problems for the opponent. I think we saw a good number of examples in this video. And if you want to download the PGN file with all the lines we discuss here and analyze them for yourselves, you can do so from my online store, the link to which is in the description of this video. You can download the PGN completely free. Also, do have a look at some of the other stuff there. I have some very good videos on other openings, so do check these out. I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.